Robert Weisbuch's Nobody's Business, Dickinson's Dissolving Audience, reviewed by Deborah Seeley. I'll admit that I found this essay rather difficult to read and to understand. It sometimes took rereading sentences over and over for me to comprehend what he was trying to say. Our author speaks on this subject as one that has intimate knowledge of a great number of Emily Dickinson's poems, since he slips them in and out of the majority of the essay's sentences as easily as one speaks their native language. Weisbuch makes three main points about Dickinson's poetry and uses many examples of the poems to prove those points. Weisbuch starts the essay by saying, quote, "Before we are women or men, Jews or Buddhists for that matter, we are people. It's a grammatical necessity," end quote, as a way of sharing the first of several points made, that Dickinson's voice was universal, gender neutral, if you will. He shares with us, his audience, a story of a debate that he and a girlfriend got into about, assumedly, Dickinson's intended point of view. He claims that the poetess, quote, "never sundered men from the we, who were often her I," end quote, and that she could be read with an, quote, "anachronistic comfort as she creates an audience of shared feeling," end quote. In other words, the experiences that Dickinson wrote about transcend gender and are experienced by all, or perhaps it is because they are experienced by all. To substantiate this claim, Weisbuch highlights the many uses of the pronouns we and us, as well as giving examples of their use. In this slide, we will see the poem numbered 584 from our book, The Poems of Emily Dickinson, that starts with the line, "We dream, it is good we are dreaming." Weisbuch claims that, quote, "the plural we occurs 542 times in nearly 300 Dickinson poems," end quote. Furthermore, he says, quote, "its tacit claim goes against class or gender divisions as definitive," end quote. In other words, he is saying that the fact that she uses the gender-neutral we shows that her poetry is meant to be universal. With this poem, as others in this slideshow, I'm going to give a couple of moments for you to read the poems if you want, because it adds to the narrative here. Weisbuch also gives examples of the use of the word us by stating, quote, "and speaking of us, there are just over 200 occasions of that word as well," end quote, as he shared the poem from page number 903 in our book. Weisbuch goes on to give several more examples of how the wording is all-inclusive and breaks the quotes down into categories such as psychological, quote, "sometimes the collectivizing plural expresses a psychological rule," end quote, epistemological, quote, "at other times the plural states a law of perception," end quote, or cosmological, quote, "as often the law is set outside the collective itself by existence," end quote. And if that is still not enough, he finally drives this point of the universal pronouns home by calling them, quote, "pronouns of humanity," end quote, and claiming once again that they represent the universal experience of all humans. Weisbuch's second point is that many of Dickinson's poems speak of a commonality of experience, and he calls them, quote, "Dickinson's definition poems," end quote. Weisbuch points out that just by the commonality of the subjects, there is what he calls a dictionary objectivity in our shared experiences. Finally, within this point, the author mentions the, quote, "missing all," end quote, by saying that the, quote, "final goals remove the particular dress of gender, race, class, personal or historical age," end quote, and that not even God is exempt from this in Dickinson's poetry, as evidenced by her many poems about God or Jesus. The next few slides are some examples of what our author calls definition poems, poems about common or shared experiences, places, and emotions. This one is about hope, and I'm going to share a little secret with you. This is my absolute all-time favorite Emily Dickinson poem, number 314 from our book. He also gives the example of heaven from poem number 310. And in poem 1125, Paradise. And finally, here's one about they. Although the word they might fit in better with the we and us pronouns a few slides prior, in this case, the, quote, they, end quote, is seen as a common enemy and as such is a shared experience, putting it in the category of definition poems by our intrepid author. This is poem number 445. As I mentioned before, Weisbuch said that deity is not exempt from this category. Here are some examples of poems about God or Jesus, which our author seems to consider a possible shared experience as well. Given the age in which Emily Dickinson was alive, the schools that she went to, and how active her family and community were in the church, it is no surprise that God and Jesus would be considered to be a common experience. It may not be now in modern times, but when these poems were written, it was. A universal one that further proves Weisbuch's point. This is poem number 670, and it's about God. And this is poem number 197 about Jesus. This poem is also mentioned later on and further on in the discussion about how Emily Dickinson can change her point of view halfway through a poem, kind of like changing horses midstream, as the saying goes. The possibility that Dickinson is a humanist was also posed within this essay, to which Weisbuch shares his point of view that she is not, due to her poetry being more democratic than aristocratic, and that we must look to what her audience is rather than who they are. He further points out that there are similar writers that have seemingly conflicting examples of selfhood, such as Melville with his books The Confidence of Man and Moby Dick, Emerson with his essays Experience and Circles, and Thoreau's essays Walking and As I Ebbed, as well as his classic book Walden. This brings us to Weisbuch's third point, a disruptive Dickinson. He is quoted as saying that there is a disruptive Dickinson too, whose love is shown in unsettling a reader. Emily Dickinson does not fit into any set boundaries or boxes, so a few of the ways that she shows her disruptivity are listed on this slide. Possibly the best known would be her frequent use of the dash. Weisbuch claims, quote, they connote an epistolatory informality, perhaps, but also a nervous rush, thus crisis, end quote, and that they cause us readers to, quote, put together meaning in such a way that it is constantly undergoing revision, end quote, This allows Dickinson to revise her point in some poems midway through. That's what I mentioned above in the slide that showed the poem about Jesus, that halfway through the poem, Emily Dickinson changed her point of view. He also mentions the formatting of the poetry, how it is laid out on the page, noting how much white space is found around certain poems. I'll give you an example in the next slide. And that this is brought about by how the lines are laid out and how some lines only have 2 words and one line even only has 1 word. Finally, we also see our author mention that Dickinson's poetry can be ambiguous. This reminded me of Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, where we, the reader, could apply our own experiences to the plot line. Many of Dickinson's poetry is the same, and he also asserts that she writes like she is a reader, or a readerly writer. The poem shown here, number 782, is an example used by Weisbuch to show both Dickinson's use of the dash, or the en dash, as I believe it is officially called, as well as formatting. The dashes do seem to get most of the attention. They kind of demand it, actually. But while the formatting is subtle, it's also really important. I feel that they work together, the dashes and the formatting, in many, if not all of her poems, to bring about her own ironic kind of harmony to her work. Poem number 134 is used by Weisbuch to illustrate what he feels is the ambiguity in Dickinson's poetry. He tells a tale about how, as a child, and keep in mind that he's 71, so this would have been in the 50s and 60s, that as a child he wanted a television set in his bedroom, which was kind of rare in those days. A lot of families couldn't even afford one television set, let alone an extra one in a child's bedroom. He bothered his parents incessantly over a couple of months to get the TV, only to find that when he had what he wanted, after a couple of times of using it, he lost all interest in it. He poses that this poem is about the desire of something waning once it is gained, and that when he read it, the story about the TV came to mind. This brings us to my take on the essay. I'm going to be honest, and as I mentioned above at the very first slide, this essay was really difficult for me to wade through, but I'm really glad that I did, because I learned a lot from his writing. And for the most part, I agree with what he had to say, even though his long, circuitous route took us a while to get there. Robert Weisbuch was able to verbalize thoughts and ideas that I already had about Dickinson's poetry, but I hadn't been able to articulate. Actually, I didn't even realize I needed to articulate it. They were rather instinctual to me, the thoughts. What I mean is that I kind of took it for granted that her voice was universal. I hadn't thought of it as any other way. By reading this essay, I saw that obviously other people didn't think the same way as I did, and that this very learned man had taken a great deal of time and care to point this out. Just to make sure of this, because I'm a woman and can only speak to a woman's point of view, I asked a few male friends of mine if it was the same for them, and they agreed that when they read the poems, it was gender neutral to them, and that she wrote about experiences that were common to them as well, that what Dickinson writes speaks to them through their own experiences. I also found in Weisbuch's essay an interesting part that I have to admit that I'm guilty of. He talked about, he says, quote, "I admit, again, I think that my reading is correct, but again, too, the point is that if so, it is so after quite a struggle, and what I deem a misreading is so nearly an alternative reading that the full meaning of the poem must include the poet's very healthy respect for renunciation." That's talking about a poem that was titled Renunciation. Dickinson's poems are not reader-friendly in the conventional ways, though, like calisthenics, they may have the reader's health in mind. And the reader's health consists of keeping the nerves progressive, the understanding ajar, and the nerves of sentiment and the understanding of cognition everywhere intertwined. In other words, he says that like calisthenics, how they kind of hurt us and we don't enjoy them, they're good for us. The same could be said towards the way Emily Dickinson writes her poetry, only mental calisthenics. Further, later on, he says that Dickinson's poems only pretend to locate an occasion for themselves and tell a story, when in fact, any posited scene is quickly revealed to be illustratory and multi-suggestive. The tens of poems about bees and flowers are finally not horticultural, and the hundreds of poems on death and dying often concern experiences within our lives well described by the pun devastating. They dramatize, end quote. And this really hit home for me because I'm a nature lover, and I thought that her poems were actually about bees and flowers, and he claims that they weren't. That a lot of them were, that a lot of the flowers and the bees, much like the poem about the harebell and the bee, were illustrations to bring about a different understanding. And I have to say, I agree with him on this. I was a little disappointed to think that maybe these weren't about bees and flowers, but he's right, and I have to admit it, which gives me a deeper understanding of Dickinson's work, and it's going to make me go back and reread all these poems again with a different point of view. Here's the other thing that I'm guilty of. He tells a story about, he recalls a colleague's, quote, I recall a colleague's angry response to my reading of the poem that begins, I started early, took my dog, and visited the sea. Poem 656. I started early, took my dog, and visited the sea. The mermaids in the basement came out to look at me. Quote, I argued that this is a poem about a visit to an experiential unknowns, unspecified, but including the wilder fantasies of the mind. He talks about how later on about how his colleague found, quote, my colleague found all of this pretentious and cried, this is just a poem about a girl and her dog visiting the seashore, end quote. The problem with that argument, of course, still quoting, the problem with that argument, of course, is that mermaids don't really exist and flood tides have rarely been seen to bow. And this is where I have to admit, I agree. I oftentimes find when authors will, in an essay or in a book, will start talking about hidden meaning and hidden agendas and feminism and homoeroticism and figurative and experiments and all that, I often find it really pretentious, and I want to say it's just a poem, or it's just a story about a girl that got in trouble and wouldn't reveal who her lover was, or it's a story about a young man on a ship that had to suffer the consequences to his actions. But I think in this case, he's right. He goes on to say that his, quote, my colleague would have had a particularly difficult time with some of the death poems, such as the one here on that I've put up, number 591, such as I heard a fly buzz when I died. And again, I have to agree, which I think is the beauty of Weisbuch's essay. He really made me think about how I feel about Emily Dickinson's poem. I think that going back to that poem about the harebell and the bee, I think that illustrates the point of this, really the whole point of this essay really well. As a girl growing up in the 70s and 80s, there was a saying, quote, why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free? It was used to remind us to be virtuous. It's a little crude, but it was used to remind us to be virtuous. And that's what came to my mind when I read the poem about the harebell and the bee. And that's a convincing argument for Weisbuch's point throughout this entire essay, that Dickinson's poetry is not gender-specific or orderly or classifiable because she writes in such a way that each person reads her work coming away with both a common meaning but an individual experience. In other words, when he read that poem, he thought about his TV as a child. When I read the poem, I thought about that saying. When other people read the poem, they might think of something totally different. And that's why Emily Dickinson is universal. This brings me to one final point that I felt that the essay was trying to make, but perhaps in a surreptitious way. And I have two illustrations to share with you that I think brings the point home. This portrait is the only official, I believe, the only official known portrait of Emily Dickinson, and it is courtesy of the Amherst College. It's in a little antique frame. There is another, by the way, there is another portrait that some people are claiming is Emily Dickinson, but the last I saw it had not been officially deemed one or not. Anyway, I believe that people look at Emily Dickinson and her poetry as antique and quaint and confusing, and that she was kind of reclusive and possibly a little bit crazy. But this is how I see it. This image is courtesy of StardogStudio.com. I see her as dynamic and colorful and in touch and relevant and timeless. Because her poetry is for an audience that reads with their own unique experiences as human beings into their work, Emily Dickinson is timeless and will continue to be timeless. That brings us to our discussion questions. Question number 1. Given what you have seen here, as well as your readings of the poems, do you feel that Dickinson's poetry is gender neutral, or is it gender specific, and why? And question 2, which of Dickinson's disruptions, that would be the dashes, the formatting, and the ambiguity, is your most favorite? Which one is your least favorite? Explain your reasons for both. Or you could just pick one and explain. Thank you for your time and for your attention. The next slide is simply just a photography slide, which as a word nerd I feel compelled to include, but really doesn't mean a whole lot to this presentation. Thank you, and God bless.